After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers with very different systems. The Cold War turned the map of the world into a tense competition between two nuclear-armed rivals. Both sides built thousands of nuclear weapons, racing to keep up with or outdo the other. Ordinary people learned new words like fallout and mutual assured destruction, and some practiced hiding under school desks. In 1959, Fidel Castro's revolution overthrew Cuba's old government. The new leadership moved closer to the Soviet Union and further away from the United States, turning an island just 90 miles from Florida into a Cold War hotspot. In 1961, a U.S.-backed invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs failed badly. The plan collapsed. Cuban forces captured many invaders, and President Kennedy felt both embarrassed and determined not to look weak again. In Moscow, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev watched these events and saw both opportunity and danger. He wanted to protect Cuba from another invasion and also improve the Soviet Union's nuclear position. The United States had nuclear missiles in places like Turkey and Italy, close to Soviet borders. Soviet leaders felt surrounded and argued that this made the balance of power unfair. Khrushchev and Castro talked about how Cuba could be protected from another U.S. attack. Stationing Soviet missiles in Cuba would deter invasion and also give Moscow a more equal nuclear position. Step by step, Soviet planners developed a secret plan to send nuclear missiles and troops to Cuba. The operation would have to be fast and hidden from American eyes as long as possible. By 1962, the Cold War, the Cuban Revolution, the Bay of Pigs, and the nuclear arms race all pointed toward a collision. None of the leaders knew it yet, but the world was heading toward 13 of the most dangerous days in history. In Soviet ports, ships quietly loaded crates, missiles, and troops labeled as agricultural equipment or other harmless cargo. Only a few people knew what was really being packed below deck. Convoys of Soviet ships set out across the Atlantic, carrying missiles, launchers, and soldiers toward Cuba. On paper, their cargo looked normal, but inside the crates were pieces of a nuclear threat. Fidel Castro agreed to accept Soviet missiles. After the Bay of Pigs, he believed that only a strong deterrent would keep the United States from trying to overthrow his government again. On Cuban soil, Soviet units started building missile sites in fields and near farms. They poured concrete, raised launch pads, and set up tents and barracks, often working quickly under tropical sun and rain. Soviet planners tried to camouflage the sites with nets, fake buildings, and covered vehicles. They hoped U.S. reconnaissance planes would not recognize the construction for what it was, at least not right away. The United States already watched Cuba closely. U-2 high-altitude spy planes had flown over the island before, keeping an eye on military bases, airfields, and suspected Soviet activity. Kennedy and his advisors worried that a U-2 might be shot down and trigger a crisis, so they balanced the need for information with the risk of provoking a confrontation. As weeks passed, Soviet missile crews in Cuba assembled the rockets and connected guidance equipment. Each day, the weapons moved closer to being able to fire toward American cities. In Moscow, Khrushchev hoped his move would balance the nuclear scales and remain secret long enough to work. In Washington, U.S. leaders still did not realize just how many missiles were now in Cuba. By early October 1962, the Soviet operation in Cuba was well underway. The world looked outwardly calm, but under the surface, the pieces of a major crisis were nearly all in place. U.S. intelligence officials pushed for another U-2 flight over western Cuba to update their information. With some hesitation, the Kennedy administration agreed, setting the stage for a crucial discovery. On October 14th, a U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba and took high-resolution photographs. When photo interpreters developed the film, they spotted long, distinct shapes and launchers that matched known Soviet missile designs. Analysts rushed their findings to Washington. The report stated clearly, medium-range nuclear missiles were being installed in Cuba, capable of striking much of the United States. President Kennedy was shown the photographs and the analysis. Quietly but clearly, he understood that the crisis was serious, and that he would have to manage it without panicking the country. Kennedy convened a special group of top advisors called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM, to debate options in secret and recommend a course of action. Some EXCOM members argued for immediate airstrikes to destroy the missiles. Others warned that a surprise attack could kill Soviet soldiers and might look like a new Pearl Harbor, pushing the world toward war. While these intense debates took place, ordinary Americans went about their daily lives, unaware that nuclear missiles had been discovered so close to their shores. In Moscow, Khrushchev still believed that his missile deployment was secret. He hoped it would strengthen his hand without leading to a direct confrontation. From the moment Kennedy saw the photos, a tense countdown began. Over the next 13 days, choices in Washington and Moscow would determine whether the crisis ended in diplomacy or in disaster. Kennedy decided to keep the discovery secret at first, giving his team time to weigh options. But he knew that soon he would have to speak to the American people and the world. As military plans were drawn up, everyone understood that missteps could lead to direct conflict between US and Soviet forces, and beyond that, to nuclear war that might destroy entire cities. In the first few days after the discovery, ExComm debated constantly. Kennedy listened to strong voices urging a swift strike, and others warning that once the first bomb fell, the outcome could not be controlled. Defense Secretary McNamara and others suggested a different approach. A naval blockade, or quarantine, around Cuba to stop more missiles from arriving while pressuring the Soviets to negotiate. Kennedy's team decided to use the word quarantine instead of blockade, to avoid legal and political arguments that the U.S. was starting a war. In a crisis, even vocabulary could be explosive. Before going public, the U.S. quietly informed key allies about the missiles in Cuba and the planned response. Keeping partners informed was vital to avoid confusion and to build a united front. Kennedy and his speechwriters worked on a nationwide address that would inform Americans, warn the Soviets, and explain the quarantine without causing panic. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy went on television and radio to reveal the missile sites and announce the naval quarantine. People around the world suddenly understood the gravity of the moment. In the Soviet Union, official broadcasts presented a very different version of events, but ordinary people also sensed that something extraordinary and dangerous was happening between the superpowers. In Cuba, Fidel Castro believed the United States might invade. Cuban forces dug trenches, moved anti-aircraft guns, and prepared for the worst. The formal crisis period is often counted from Kennedy's first briefing on the missiles to the standing down of the alert. With the quarantine announced, the 13 days of intense pressure were in full motion. U.S. forces went to higher alert levels, including lower DEFCON numbers, meaning they were more ready for potential conflict. Troops, pilots, and sailors knew that if diplomacy failed, they might be called to act. American warships formed a line around Cuba, ready to intercept Soviet vessels that might be carrying more missiles or military equipment. Soviet merchant ships and escorts continued toward Cuba, unsure of how firmly the United States would enforce the quarantine, or whether shots might be fired. Newspapers and television stations described the growing confrontation at sea. People imagined U.S. and Soviet ships aiming weapons at each other across the waves. U.S. ships tracked Soviet vessels approaching the quarantine line. Some Soviet ships slowed or turned back rather than risk direct confrontation, a small but important sign that both sides wanted to avoid war. From Washington and Moscow, Kennedy and Khrushchev watched the reports. Neither wanted to look weak, but both knew that if a naval clash escalated, it could be extremely hard to stop. Khrushchev sent letters to Kennedy, sometimes emotional and sometimes firm, suggesting possible deals. Kennedy's team studied every word, looking for ways to reduce tension without giving up core security goals. During the crisis, communication relied on letters, embassies, and slow channels. There was no direct crisis hotline between Washington and Moscow yet, which made misunderstandings more likely. Strategic bombers, missile crews, and submarine crews on both sides remained on alert. Many of them did not know all the details of the negotiations, only that they might be called upon with little warning. Ordinary people in the United States, the Soviet Union, and around the globe listened to news reports, unsure if the next announcement would be about peace or war. On October 27th, sometimes called Black Saturday, a U.S. U-2 was shot down over Cuba, and a U.S. destroyer dropped practice depth charges near a Soviet submarine, bringing the crisis frighteningly close to open conflict. Kennedy received two very different messages from Khrushchev, one softer, one harder. ExComm had to decide which message to respond to and how to craft a reply that could lead to de-escalation. Behind the scenes, unofficial channels involving diplomats and emissaries explored possible trade-offs, including removing U.S. missiles from Turkey in exchange for missiles leaving Cuba. Kennedy's team proposed replying only to Khrushchev's more conciliatory letter, offering not to invade Cuba if the Soviet missiles were withdrawn. Privately, U.S. officials considered also removing old American missiles from Turkey, but they did not want to announce this publicly in a way that would seem like they were giving in under pressure. Khrushchev had to weigh the prestige of standing firm against the terrifying risk of nuclear war. The blockade, the U-2 incident, and the danger of misunderstanding pushed him towards seeking a way out. Gradually, an agreement formed. The Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba and allow verification, while the United States promised not to invade Cuba and later removed its missiles from Turkey. Part of the compromise was public, the withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba and the U.S. non-invasion pledge. Part was secret, the removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey months later. Both sides stepped back from the edge. Although tensions remained, the decision to compromise rather than fire weapons meant that the Cuban Missile Crisis ended without nuclear war. Soviet missiles in Cuba were dismantled and shipped back. U.S. reconnaissance confirmed the removal, and the quarantine line was lifted. The most dangerous phase of the crisis was over. In 1963, U.S. Jupiter missiles in Turkey were quietly removed and replaced over time with other strategic systems, completing the less visible half of the bargain. When the crisis eased, people across the globe felt profound relief. Newspapers and radio stations spoke openly about how close the world had come to nuclear war. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev privately admitted that the crisis had frightened them. They had stared into the possibility of mutual destruction and wanted to make sure it never happened again. One famous result of the crisis was the creation of a direct communication line, the so-called hotline, between Washington and Moscow, so leaders could talk more quickly during future emergencies. After the crisis, the superpowers began exploring arms control more seriously, leading within a year to the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which restricted nuclear tests in the atmosphere, in space, and underwater. Cuba stayed aligned with the Soviet Union and remained a focus of U.S. attention. The missile crisis ended, but the island's political role in the Cold War continued. For ordinary people in both the United States and the Soviet Union, the memory of those tense days lingered. Many remembered listening to radios and wondering if nuclear sirens would sound. Today, the Cuban Missile Crisis is studied in schools, war colleges, and diplomacy programs as an example of how close the world came to disaster, and how careful, even if imperfect, decision-making helped avoid it. The crisis reminds us how dangerous nuclear weapons are, and how misunderstandings, accidents, and pride can push leaders toward choices with global consequences. Ultimately, the Cuban Missile Crisis did not end because machines made the right call, but because human beings on all sides decided to step back. Their judgment, caution, and willingness to compromise saved lives. Our tiny historians remind us that the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world close to nuclear midnight, but also showed that brave, careful decisions can pull us back from the edge. By studying those 13 days, we learn why diplomacy, communication, and restraint still matter whenever nuclear weapons are involved.